In the heart of Cleveland, Ohio, there was once a river that burned. Not once, not twice, but at least 13 times. Today, we're going to tell you about an environmental disaster so absurd that it helped change the course of American history. The story of the Cuyahoga River, a body of water so polluted that it would regularly burst into flames. Let's rewind to 1881, when Cleveland's mayor proudly declared, "The river is black and smells bad, but that's a sign of prosperity." He wasn't entirely wrong. Cleveland was rapidly transforming into an industrial hub, with steel mills, oil refineries, and chemical plants lining the Cuyahoga River, producing materials that would help build America. But they were also dumping something far more harmful into the water. The Cuyahoga River wasn't just polluted. It was a dangerous, toxic mix. Industrial waste, oil, chemicals, and sewage had turned the river into a murky, toxic soup. The water was so contaminated that fish couldn't survive and plants couldn't grow nearby. The only things flourishing were the industries that were slowly killing the river. By the early 1900s, the pollution was so extreme that locals claimed you could tell what color paint factories were producing by the river's hue that day. The Cuyahoga had ceased being a river. It had become a waste-filled canal running through the heart of an American city. The pollution was far beyond what we can imagine today. The river's chemical concentration was so intense that workers' metal buttons would corrode in a week. In fact, the chemicals were potent enough to dissolve metal itself. Oil and waste had created a thick layer on the water's surface, sometimes reaching up to 3 inches in thickness. It wasn't just the typical rainbow film you might see in a parking lot puddle. It was a dense mat of petroleum and chemicals that you could almost walk on. Ships navigating through the river left trails behind them in the sludge, which lingered for hours. Some sections of the river were so polluted that the water was completely hidden, replaced by moving masses of black industrial waste. The stench was unbearable. Residents described the odor as a mix of burning chemicals, rotting eggs, and decay. Drivers crossing bridges would roll up their windows even on the hottest summer days. Birds avoided the area entirely. Plants along the riverbanks didn't just wither, they were eaten away. What was perhaps most shocking was how normal all of this seemed to everyone. To industries, the river was simply a convenient place to dump their waste. Workers even joked that anyone falling into the Cuyahoga wouldn't drown, they'd dissolve. This wasn't a river anymore. It was an open sewer, carrying the cost of progress through the center of Cleveland. The first recorded fire on the Cuyahoga occurred in 1868. Surprising people at the time, a river catching fire seemed almost impossible. But by the early 1900s, such fires were common enough that Cleveland's fire department had to develop specialized equipment to tackle them. These weren't small, contained fires either. Flames would regularly reach 5 stories high, threatening nearby bridges and buildings. Firefighters faced an unusual challenge. How do you put out a fire floating on water? Traditional firefighting techniques were useless against burning chemicals and oil. To deal with this, the department created boats equipped with high-powered foam sprayers, as water alone wouldn't put out chemical fires. They also devised floating barriers to contain the fires, because a river was never meant to burn. By the mid-1900s, the fires were so frequent that Cleveland earned the nickname, "the city with the river that burns." Local newspapers didn't even treat the fires as major events. They had become an accepted part of life in the city. Some industries even argued that the fires helped clean the river by burning off pollutants. But the worst was yet to come. While the Cuyahoga had burned several times before, the fire on June 22, 1969 would grab national attention and become the catalyst for a major environmental movement. That fire wasn't even the worst the river had seen. A much larger blaze in 1952 had caused over $1.5 million in damage. However, the 1969 fire occurred at a pivotal moment, when the U.S. was beginning to wake up to environmental issues. When Time magazine covered the story, they used a dramatic photograph from the 1952 fire rather than the 1969 blaze. The iconic image showed flames engulfing a boat on the river, shooting high into the Cleveland sky. It became a symbol of the destructive effects of industrial pollution. despite few realizing it was from a previous fire. The magazine's headline read, "America's Sewage System and the Price of Optimism," and the article depicted Cleveland as a cautionary tale of unchecked industrial progress. The image of a river so polluted that it could burst into flames became a potent symbol of environmental neglect. The fires on the Cuyahoga were no longer just a local problem. They represented everything wrong with America's environmental policies. Local musician Randy Newman even wrote the song "Burn On," humorously referencing the burning river. The song's chorus, "Burn on, big river, burn on," was a sardonic tribute that highlighted the absurdity of the situation. What had once been a joke was now becoming a serious symbol of the country's environmental issues. By 1969, Cleveland's reputation was in flames, just like its river. But sometimes it takes a disaster to prompt change, and this one would help spark the environmental movement in America. This fire became the tipping point. While local officials tried to downplay the significance, national outrage was brewing. The pollution wasn't just about one river anymore. It symbolized industrial America's reckless disregard for environmental concerns. The fire occurred at a time when a newly elected Congress was eager to tackle environmental problems, and the burning river became the perfect example of the need for change. The Cuyahoga Fire helped rally environmental activists across the country. The fire helped inspire the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. Even President Nixon, not exactly known for environmental advocacy, signed the order that established the agency. A few years later, the Clean Water Act of 1972 became one of the most significant pieces of environmental legislation in U.S. history, setting strict water quality standards and holding industries accountable for pollution. For Cleveland, this national reckoning came at a steep cost. The new regulations forced factories to either clean up their operations or shut down entirely. Over 100 factories along the Cuyahoga River closed their doors or relocated during the 1970s. The city, once proud of its industrial prosperity, now faced the economic consequences of its pollution. The cleanup of the Cuyahoga River became a monumental undertaking, costing over $3.5 billion, the largest river restoration project in the country at the time. Decades of industrial waste had to be painstakingly removed, with workers dredging thick layers of contaminated sediment from the riverbed. The pollution had been so severe that it had altered the chemistry of the water, corroding infrastructure like docks and bridges. Slowly but surely, the Cuyahoga began to transform. By the 1980s, fish returned to parts of the river that had been lifeless for generations, and plants began to grow along banks that had been barren for decades. The chemical stench that had once defined the Cuyahoga started to fade into the past. This was more than a physical recovery. It was cultural. Cleveland, long derided as the mistake on the lake, began to see its river's notorious history as a symbol of renewal. What had once been a source of shame now stood as proof of how far the city had come. By the 1990s, the river's turnaround was so striking that scientists from across the globe visited to study it. The river that had once been so polluted it could catch fire was now an environmental success story. But this wasn't just about cleaning up pollution. It was about redefining what an urban river could be. Cleveland transformed the old industrial sites along the river into parks and public spaces. The rusted factories that once pumped toxins into the water were replaced with restaurants, entertainment venues, and hiking trails. The river, once an area to avoid, became a vibrant, attractive place to visit. The recovery was so thorough that wildlife began to return in large numbers. Species that had been absent from the Cuyahoga for over a century were now making a comeback. By 2019, the river's recovery was so complete that it was named River of the Year by American Rivers, not for its past as an environmental disaster, but for its stunning recovery. This wasn't just an environmental victory. The Cuyahoga's recovery showed that even the most damaged environments could be restored with enough effort and determination. Cleveland's success became a model for other cities around the world, offering valuable lessons in cleaning up polluted rivers. Once notorious for its fires, the Cuyahoga was now seen as a symbol of hope. Its recovery showed that severe environmental damage didn't have to be permanent, offering proof that change was possible when people took action. The Cuyahoga's influence stretched far beyond the city itself. It became a powerful case study in environmental law. Law schools began teaching the Cuyahoga story as an example of how public outrage could drive legislative change. Environmental science programs began using the river's recovery as a blueprint for large-scale ecosystem restoration. The Cuyahoga's most significant impact, however, was on public awareness. The iconic image of a river on fire became a wake-up call for citizens across the country. It sparked a wave of environmental activism, with local groups demanding greater transparency on pollution in their own communities. Industries that once operated without public scrutiny suddenly found themselves under the microscope. The Cuyahoga's disaster and subsequent recovery contributed to the passage of the Clean Water Act, a landmark environmental law passed in 1972. States began adopting even stricter water protection regulations, realizing that unchecked industrial progress couldn't come at the cost of the environment. This shift in public attitudes fundamentally changed how Americans viewed environmental regulation. Before the Cuyahoga, pollution was often seen as a localized issue. Afterward, people understood that environmental harm didn't respect city or state boundaries. The Cuyahoga also played a key role in shaping modern watershed management. The river taught that pollution couldn't be isolated to a single stretch of water. Pollution upstream would affect downstream ecosystems. As a result, environmental protection became more comprehensive. Moreover, Cuyahoga's recovery changed the way success was measured in environmental terms. Simple metrics like, "Is the river on fire?" evolved into more sophisticated assessments, focusing on water quality, biodiversity, and ecosystem health. The Environmental Protection Agency developed new standards, many of which were first implemented on the Cuyahoga itself. Industries had to adapt to a new reality. Companies that once treated rivers as convenient waste dumps had to innovate, developing processes that minimized environmental damage. Pollution prevention became an integral part of business operations, driven by regulations inspired by the Cuyahoga's past. The river's influence also extended into urban planning. Cities began to view environmental protection as essential for development, understanding that healthy waterways could provide economic benefits, not just be industrial casualties. Today, the Cuyahoga River tells a very different story. Once plagued by oil slicks, it now attracts kayakers. The land that once hosted polluting factories is now home to breweries and restaurants. People fish in waters that once dissolved metals. This transformation, unimaginable 50 years ago, highlights the remarkable turnaround. But this recovery isn't just about cleaner water. The Cuyahoga has become a symbol of Cleveland's identity. The city now celebrates its environmental progress with the annual Burning River Fest and has local breweries offering Burning River Pale Ale, made with water from the river that once burned. Scientists continue to monitor the river, and their findings are positive. Species diversity has exploded. Fish that hadn't been seen in over a century have returned, and eagles now nest along the banks. The Cuyahoga has transformed into one of the most diverse urban ecosystems in the U.S. Yet, the cleanup isn't fully complete. Sections of the riverbed still contain pollutants from the past, and urban storm runoff remains a challenge. But now these issues are actively addressed rather than ignored. The Cuyahoga story has become essential learning in environmental science worldwide. It's used to teach future generations about the consequences of neglecting environmental responsibility and the possibility of recovery. While the Cuyahoga's recovery is impressive, it also sheds light on new environmental challenges. Today's threats are more subtle than the industrial waste of the past, but no less dangerous. Urban runoff brings oil, fertilizers, and microplastics to the river. Climate change has introduced additional risks. More frequent heavy rains overwhelm sewage systems, and rising temperatures stress fish populations by lowering oxygen levels. These new challenges have led to innovative solutions. Cleveland has embraced green infrastructure, utilizing natural systems to filter stormwater before it reaches the river. Rain gardens, permeable pavements, and restored wetlands now protect the Cuyahoga from modern pollution. The city has also learned that environmental protection and economic growth can go hand in hand. The river's recovery has boosted Cleveland's economy. Property values along the Cuyahoga have risen. Tourism has surged, and new businesses have sprung up along its shores. The river that once represented industrial destruction is now an economic asset. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Cuyahoga's recovery is the need for vigilance. The river's restoration didn't happen by chance, and its preservation requires constant attention. Routine testing, monitoring, and swift action to address issues are now part of daily life around the river. In 2019, when the Cuyahoga was named River of the Year, it wasn't just celebrating a cleanup, it marked a revolution in how Americans view the environment. The river that had once been a symbol of environmental disaster had become a beacon of hope, proving that even the most damaged ecosystems can be restored. The Cuyahoga story continues to inspire environmental policy worldwide. When China addressed its severe river pollution in the 2000s, officials studied the Cuyahoga's recovery. Similarly, when India began cleaning up the Ganges River, they turned to Cleveland's experience. The river that burned became a global lesson in environmental recovery. Today, the Cuyahoga serves as both a warning and a symbol of hope. It reminds us of the consequences of prioritizing industrial progress over environmental protection, but also of the possibility that such damage doesn't have to be permanent. A river that burned at least 13 times is now proof that recovery is possible. Perhaps the most powerful lesson from the Cuyahoga is about human nature. It took dramatic events to wake people up to environmental destruction. Sometimes it takes disasters to force action. The real question is, will we wait for more rivers to burn before addressing today's environmental challenges? Looking at the Cuyahoga today, with its clean waters and revived wildlife, it's hard to believe that it was once so polluted it could ignite. But the historical records, the old photographs, and the lasting changes in environmental law remind us that this transformation is real. A river burned, a nation awakened, and the world changed. Next time someone claims environmental damage is the unavoidable cost of progress, tell them the story of the Cuyahoga. Share the story of the river that burned so many times it changed America. And remind them that, with enough effort and dedication, even the most damaged parts of the world can be restored. We'll see you next time.